Hello everybody and welcome back to another exciting edition of Boyographic, the show in which I, Matt the Game Boy, will talk you through the highs and lows of the Game Boy library, one card at a time. This week we'll be looking at, yet again, another excellent license title for your license. It's Jurassic Park Part 2, The Chaos Continues. It's fair to say that regardless of what you think of British developer Ocean Software, they had some pretty good ideas from time to time. It would be easy to hold up games like Hudson Hawk or Cool World as a counterpoint to this argument, but they really did. Despite what you think of their games, especially in regards to their difficulty settings, Ocean Software was really home to some of the greatest minds Britain ever produced in the video gaming sphere. With these great minds came the great ideas I previously mentioned, all to the benefit of games like Robocop and the NES port of Parasol Stars. The subject of this week's video, however, is in a lot of respects a stroke of genius. The year is 1993, and Jurassic Park sees its big screen debut. On the home console, Ocean's own top-down take on the adventures of Dr. Grant & Co. is selling like hotcakes. But there's just one problem. These gamers are clearly hungry for more. At the time, The Lost World was just a gleam in Steven Spielberg's eye, not to mention a thorn in Michael Crichton's side. So Ocean took it upon themselves to follow up Jurassic Park with a sequel of their own, calling it Jurassic Park Part 2, The Chaos Continues. Launching in January 1995, a full 8 months before the novel of Crichton's official sequel, Ocean's non-canonical continuation came out on both the Super Nintendo and the Game Boy to pretty lukewarm reviews. While the Super Nintendo title deserved such scorn, the Game Boy game is, dare I say it, a hidden gem on the platform. While the SNES game has a narrative wrapped around corporate espionage and armed militia, the Game Boy game plot is damn simple. Dr. Grant's Jeep has broken down because of a power outage, and he's got to get back to safety. Instead of the top-down adventure the player experienced in the first game, Jurassic Park Part 2 is, you guessed it, a run-and-gun platformer. Just like Batman in Sunsoft's Game Boy efforts, Dr. Grant is packing heat here to, as the back of the box says, close the doors on Jurassic Park for another 65 million years. Okay, so it's a run and gun game. Why the hell would you call this a hidden gem, Matt? Well, in all honesty, because it's a pretty damn good one. I'd even go so far as to say that on my journey to review the Game Boy library one card at a time, it's the best game Ocean made for the system. Not exactly a high bar, I know, but what the game lacks in originality is more than made up for in solid gameplay. It needs to be said from the off that the game doesn't really break any new ground. Grant has the same two weapons throughout the game, a gun and a grenade, the gun firing further and more rapidly, while the grenade hits for more damage and is only really good for close-up combat and hitting enemies below you. No power-ups, no extra weapons, nothing of the sort. But you know what? That's actually perfectly fine, as you really only need the two of them. When you combine this with the fact that Part 2 has incredibly responsive platforming across the game's 4 zones, you're really onto a winner. To get through these zones, you're going to need to collect electronic keycards scattered throughout the level and make it to the exit. As you'd imagine, this becomes more tricky as you advance through the game's 4 zones, as, believe it or not, the game has a pretty decent learning curve. These zones generally consist of 2 stages, followed by a quick boss battle at the end against a bigger, more threatening dino. While these bosses' patterns are relatively straightforward, their sprite work is impressive both in scale and in level of detail. The smoothness of their animation is also something to be admired, as to Ocean's credit, there is very little screen tear at all present in the game. But that's not all, folks. Between zones, Grant also gets chased by a screen-sized T-Rex in auto-scrolling platforming sequences that really put you through your paces. While these sections do rely on memorization a little more heavily than they probably should, as hitting our good friend Mr. T-Rex is insta-death for Dr. Grant, they never really feel too frustrating. You don't even need to collect all the key cards on these stages, though doing so will grant the Doctor extra lives, which, if you're anything like me, you'll desperately need after these stages, as they're clearly only there to raise the generally lax difficulty level. Yes folks, you heard that right, it's an easy ocean title. Well, not too easy. As I mentioned, you do need to memorise some levels and boss patterns, but for an ocean game especially, Jurassic Park Part 2 has what I like to call a predictable level of bastardry. What do I mean by that? Well, you can generally tell where enemies are going to spawn, the game never gives you impossible jumps, and Grant is very rarely overwhelmed by enemies. The hardest stage in the entire game in my opinion is arguably Zone 3-1, an auto-scrolling level on sea where giant sea dinos pop their heads out of the water to take a chunk out of the good doctor, not to mention the constant threat of fossils flying in your face and some tricky platforming. But this is offset by predictable spawns as I mentioned. If you've not encountered a sea monster, chances are it means you're not close enough one to trigger their spawn. So ride forward, let a whirlpool appear, then immediately slide back and shoot. Trust me, it works every time. It isn't just predictability that's on the player's side in this game though, it's generous lives and med pickups dotted around the park to make it bearable to play. Sure, you only get 2 continues in the game, but this should be more than enough to get Grant safely out of the park. While the last few levels start to introduce conveyor belts, spikes and bigger dinosaurs, they're all very easy to breeze through if you're relatively confident with this type of run and gun game. With great visuals, tight gameplay and a fair level of difficulty, I really do stand by my decision to call this game a hidden gem for the Game Boy. Sure, there are better games in the genre on the system, but you know about those, so they're not hidden gems. Jurassic Park 2 though is a solid sequel to the first game that was not only smart enough to directly copy-paste Jonathan Dunn's amazing score, but to not simply put out the same game twice. While it might from the off seem a little bit generic, little touches like Grant wiping his brow at the end of a stage and the variety of dinos on offer here really helps the goodness shine through. While the company might have been a little preoccupied with whether or not they could, it turns out that not stopping to think if they should make a sequel to Jurassic Park was the best thing for everything. As you know what? They did it. The sons of bitches did it. Forget The Lost World, the sequel we all needed to the original game was Ocean's own efforts in Jurassic Park Part 2. The chaos continues. And that brings us to the end of another episode of Boyographic, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you've enjoyed. Please check out the channel next week where we'll be wrapping up your license with a little bit of Disney. And until then, check out some other videos if you haven't already. Please be also sure to like and subscribe and share the channel with others you think might be interested, and check me out on Twitter at Gameboy. But until then, Game Boys and Girls, be sure to game on.